The subject of this video made me a little bit angry at first, but maybe it's me. Maybe it's me that's wrong and I've been missing a trick for the last 44 years since I took up photography. If you have a view on the subject, please leave a comment below because I'll be interested to hear other people's views. It started with seeing some videos on YouTube where the person mentions that they only ever use manual exposure mode. And they've got quite a condescending attitude to anyone who uses any form of automation with their exposure. And then last week, I got a comment on one of my videos that real photographers never use auto, whatever a real photographer is. If you have any ideas, please leave a comment below. I use fully automatic or semi-automatic exposure mode virtually all the time. But obviously that's because I'm not a real photographer. If I was a real photographer, I would only use manual mode. So I was thinking about some scenarios if I only used manual mode. And firstly, you can't just arbitrarily select a shutter speed and an aperture because you're probably not going to get the right exposure. You can't think, well, I need to freeze the action, so I'm going to use 1,000ths of a second, and I want lots of depth of field, so I'm going to use f11, because in most cases, that's going to be very underexposed. You need to prioritize one or the other, and then balance the other value to get the right exposure. So let's just go through a few scenarios. If I go to watch my lad play football, which I do quite often, I want to put a priority on shutter speed. I want a fast shutter speed to freeze action. So if I'm being a real photographer, and I'm only allowed to use manual exposure mode, I'm going to put the camera into manual mode, plug in 1,000th of a second as my shutter speed. Now, what about the aperture? Do I just guess? That's probably not a very good idea. Do I use a light meter? If I use a reflective reading, the focal length of the light meter isn't the same as the telephoto lens that I'm using, so it's not going to be very accurate. Do I stop play, run onto the pitch, stick this in front of my son's face to get an incident meter reading, run back and then plug that into my camera, tell them that they can continue playing, then take the shot? That doesn't sound like a very good idea either. Or do I just use shutter speed priority on the camera? Then it will automatically give me the correct aperture. And the advantage is that if the light changes, then the camera will adjust. If the sun suddenly goes behind a cloud, or if I change the composition and I get a different light reading, the camera just adjusts automatically. It makes far more sense to use a semi-automatic mode than a manual mode. If I'm out doing some street photography and I want to take a portrait, I'll probably decide to concentrate on depth of field. I want a shallow depth of field to blur the background and to make the portrait stand out. So I might select f2, which is a very wide aperture. So what about shutter speed? Again, it's probably not a very good idea to guess. Do I go and shove a light meter in the guy's face to get an incident reading? And what I found with street photography and photographing people is that most people don't mind as long as you're fairly quick. But what they don't want is you to sort of be messing around for a long time to get all the right settings on your camera. They want it to be over and done with quite quickly. So in that situation, just use aperture priority. Select the widest aperture on your lens, and then the camera will automatically set a suitable shutter speed. Again, I can't really see the point of using aperture priority just to find out what the shutter speed is, and then turning the camera back into manual mode, and then plugging in that shutter speed. Why not just use aperture priority mode? It just doesn't make any sense to use manual mode. Those are two examples of using the camera in a semi-automatic mode, aperture priority or shutter speed priority. In other situations, I'm quite happy to put the camera into fully automatic mode. Street photography or travel photography, maybe it's somewhere I've never been before. So I'm looking all the time at subjects, things to take photos of, and I'm thinking about composition, what I want in the frame. And I don't really have time to think about exposure as well. So putting the camera into automatic mode allows me just to concentrate on composition and I don't have to worry about exposure. And 99% of the time, that's fine, and the results will be very good. Have I ever had problems with fully automatic mode? Yes, I have, but it's quite rare, and only with one particular camera body and one particular lens. This is the original Canon EOS M, and this is the EFM 55-200. And in fully automatic mode, everything automatic, including the ISO. What I found was that the camera wanted to set a very fast shutter speed because it's a telephoto lens, but it's also quite slow. At 200mm, it's only f6.3. And in order to get that very fast shutter speed with a slow lens, the camera was setting a very high ISO, and that was introducing some grain and not making the images very sharp. So once I realized the problem, I just changed the ISO from auto to a low setting, 100 ISO or 200 ISO. The image stabilization on this lens is actually very good, so you don't need a very fast shutter speed. Even hand holding, you can get away with quite slow shutter speeds because the image stabilization is so good. This digital camera technology has been around a long time now, and the manufacturers have got a lot of experience, and the exposure programs inside the cameras are very good. So in most cases, if you're using a fully automatic or semi-automatic mode, the results are going to be very good. There's just no need, as far as I can see, to use manual exposure. Do I ever use manual exposure myself? And yes, sometimes I do, but normally only for flash photography. With flash photography, you can think of it as two separate exposures in the same frame. The background exposure depends on your aperture and shutter speed, and your subject exposure depends on your aperture and the amount of light that's outputted from the flash. And also, the shutter speed is limited because it can't be any faster than the sync speed of the camera. So what I'll often do is to put the camera into shutter speed priority mode and set it to the sync speed. Take a reading of the background and make a note of the aperture. Put the camera into manual mode and put in the shutter speed and aperture manually. And for the subject exposure, I will leave that to TTL. This is the through the lens metering. So what happens with that is that the flash starts to put out light. That light is reflected from the subject back through the lens, and the camera meters how much light is necessary. And when it's got the necessary amount of light, it will then turn off the flash. So hopefully the exposure of the subject and the exposure of the background will be balanced and the whole scene will look natural. Just to summarize, I think this whole business of only using manual exposure mode, if you want to be a real photographer or a pro photographer, it's just nonsense. There might be times when it's appropriate to use manual exposure. Other times it'll be more appropriate to use fully automatic or semi-automatic. As I said earlier in the video, I'll be interested to hear other people's views, so please leave a comment below. And just one more thing, I've mentioned the semi-automatic modes, shutter speed priority and aperture priority. Well, actually, I use neither these days. The camera I use now, I've been using for a few years, is the Canon EOS M6 Mark II. It's a camera I'm very, very happy with. And that has the Canon flexible mode on it, which is a kind of combined aperture priority and shutter speed priority. So in one place, I can change the aperture, the shutter speed, the ISO, and the exposure compensation. So really, it makes shutter speed priority and aperture priority redundant. Thank you for watching.